Welcome back. Wednesday morning here in the mountains. Happy Wednesday wherever you are, if it's your evening. So happy to be meditating with you again today. We have about 10 minutes to sit. I will invite my dear friend Jenny Stefanati, who founded Becoming Denizen, on at the end of our sitting. She is releasing our podcast episode, I think this morning actually, so I'd like to talk to her a little bit. Hola, Bex. Hi, sister. Nice to see you, Angel. I would love to just walk us into this meditation with a tiny hint. So as you get settled, lengthen your spine, soften your eyes, soften your face. Allow yourself to feel a little more present in your posture. Allow that presence to inform the way that you're breathing. And just take about 3 full deep breaths here. This quiet space generated by each of us in our own spaces at the same time is felt throughout all creation. Each one of us sitting creates a little ripple of calm in the world. Each one of us is adding to the peace in the world when we sit. It doesn't take long. Allow all of the ideas about yourself, where you are, who you are, what you're doing, allow it all to just gently come back into your body from the outside world as you breathe in. And as you exhale, let all of those ideas gently settle. Inhalation, gathering your attention. Exhalation, letting it settle. Focusing for today on this sense of settling, this quality of allowing all the ideas that we have, all the notions that we have about who we are and what we're doing, allowing it all just to settle deeply inside, and allowing that settling to be a source of great composure and calm. For these handful of minutes to be a source of peace for all. just a couple more minutes here in the quiet. Spine is tall, face is soft, front body soft and open. A sense of equanimity emerging from the center of your body. A combination of strength and softness, resilience and ease. See if you can stay with yourself and stay with this. And I'll come get you in a few minutes. Allowing your breath to calm your mind, to sweep your mind. To soften your mind. Take a deep breath in. And exhale, relax your shoulders, your neck, your face. Lengthen your spine, inhale. Give yourself a little smile and exhale. You can bring your hands to prayer if you'd like to close the sitting. We have no goal other than to settle the self. No goal other than to add to the peace in the world. No goal other than to expand our capacity for kindness, for service, for listening really well to what's happening around us. Thank you for your practice. Dedicating any merit whatsoever to those who need it the most today. Thank you for your practice. I'm going to go ahead and look for Jenny, and we'll bring her on. There we go. We'll wait a couple moments to see if she finds us. If not, that's okay. Thank you, Sarah Kelly. Thank you so much.
Good morning.
We did it, sister. We did it.
My first Instagram live.
How wonderful. Hi.
Hi.
Hi, babe. So tell us about the podcast. Tell us about the podcast overall. Tell us
Mm.
about your work overall that I find to be so important in this world. And then tell us about the episode that dropped today.
Okay, well, thank you so much for having me on. Well, the work in general is just exploring this very deep question of systemic change,
Yes.
something that I think all deeply know needs to happen, but I think all feel a lot of overwhelm at even beginning to answer that question.
Yes.
So, just a little bit about my background. I was at Google for a long time, where you learn the story of technology saving the world. And then I got my master's degree at the Kennedy School at Harvard, in international development, where they taught you that economic growth will save the world. And so a lot of the conversation is really challenging both of those narratives. I think
Yes.
we can look at the world around us and understand that both of those don't seem to hold to be true. Um, and
Imagine
so
going to
and
school for all this time to learn all the things that you need to now completely shift.
Yeah, I mean, I was really kind of underwhelmed at the curriculum at the Kennedy School, and I was holding a lot of questions that I just started to answer myself. So the genesis was, I think you know this, just missing the intellectual rigor of graduate school, reading white papers and talking about them in class, and so I started to organize my friends to do that periodically over the years, because I felt like there were these topics that I really wanted to understand more deeply, but I struggled to find the time to understand more deeply.
Right.
And so I would pick a topic and I would send some papers or some readings, and it was always very optional and easy, and just show up and hang out if you want to hang out and learn about it. And I started to do that virtually during the pandemic, because the pandemic was
Right.
this moment where everybody started to um, you know, everyone really started to question everything. And I felt like all these people were saying, like, this is the moment for the big systemic change. And then no one could really kind of double click on that and say, well, why? And so I started hosting, it started as a two-part conversation on capitalism and inequality on universal basic income. The first meeting was actually the week that George Floyd was murdered, so that we instantly pivoted station about how that felt for everyone. Um, Twitter labeled Trump's tweets. That was really a moment where everybody started really talking about content moderation on social media. In our small group of 30 people, we had people like Tristan Harris, who started the Center for Humane
Yeah.
Technology, one of the people behind the Social Dilemma, Rob Reich from Stanford, who teaches ethics at Stanford. We had, one of the person who led up ad products at Facebook when Facebook was weaponized in the 2016 election. So these are the type of people in my network that were coming together for these conversations.
Yes.
Um, and and we were all really enjoying them, and I was really appreciating them because I was learning about so many things that I thought were so important, and we started to do them on Clubhouse. And that's where you and I met. So this is the very early days of Clubhouse, and Dent at the time was one of the very first clubs on Clubhouse. Um, and the conversation just really took off from there. So there we grew to an audience of 85,000 people over the first couple of years. We kind of took off with Clubhouse, and it turned in from just my friends on Zoom to this bigger thing. And I always started recording the conversations. I mean, recording the conversations was something that I started to do even in the beginning when we were just on Zoom, because people would say, I can't come, but I really wanna
Learned.
hear that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so over the years we amassed an archive of 100 conversations, because I was doing one, sometimes two a week. And so eventually, we everyone was asking, where's the podcast?
Mm.
It's a much easier form to consume the content. So there are 6 themes under this banner of what I call the Denizen Inquiry. It's economics, so a lot of interrogation of capitalism and what economic system that utilizes all the things that are valuable about a market, but not all the things that are detrimental about capitalism. What does that look like?
Mm.
So that's a big part of the conversation. We talk about politics and different systems of governance.
Right.
Another theme is culture. So how does cultural change happen? How does that affect politics? How does that affect economics? How does economics affect culture? That's a really big theme in the conversation. We also talk about consciousness, which is really important. And then finally we talk about technology and justice. So we talk about tech only insofar as tech is relevant for the systems that we inhabit, right? So understanding how social media affects democracy and our ability to collectively make sense of the world. We talk about blockchain and Web3 insofar as it affects those systems of understanding and culture and connection, also insofar as it provides space for experimenting with new economic systems and structures. And then the last of the pillars is justice. Because at the top level, we're holding this question of like, what does a society that is fundamentally just and regenerative and caring look like? And how might we transition from where we are today to there? And so you can't have a conversation about that without talking about justice and looking at historical oppression. And I feel very strongly that all of us have a role to play in that work. So those are the pillars. And I try to take, a topic that one can understand in the course of a 45-minute, they tend to be an hour conversation. And really try to just make it very easy for somebody to come into a conversation and understand the topic and then come out of it. And then if you want to go on the website, there's, the papers that I read to prepare and more resources from our guests that are always available. That's what the podcast is. And then related to that, started out as my friends. The conversation has been a magnet for this really incredible community of people. Probably about 200 people who are quite engaged, who, we've done a retreat twice a year. We also do things like a nonviolent communication course, which I know is very, very much up your alley.
Yeah.
The whole thesis is that the change happens because we all take responsibility for it and do the work. And so learning how the ways in which we communicate are reflective of the very systems that we want to change, the very paradigms that we want to shift, and how other ways of relating, capture those other ways that we want to be is very eye-opening. So nonviolent communication was a very eye-opening thing. It was really amazing for us to do that in community. About 40 of us did that together. So the community component, really is adjacent to the podcast and the content piece.
Got it. Dent, when you first started, was about making a dent, I assume, in this conversation, in this paradigm.
Well, actually, Dent I was using Dent. The genesis is actually great. Do you know who Eric Ries is? He wrote The Lean Startup. Have you heard of that book?
No.
So the Lean Startup's quite an influential book in Silicon Valley and beyond, which is, he wrote it, I think, back in 2010, maybe? Yeah, 2010. Just talked about best practices in Silicon Valley around minimally investing in a product and putting it out and testing assumptions and then iterating. So Eric has subsequently actually started a company that he mentioned in the Lean Startup. It's called the Long-Term Stock Exchange, which is a very ambitious endeavor to start a new stock exchange that incentivizes companies to manage for longer term time horizons than a quarter. I'm actually going to do an episode very soon with Michelle Green, who is currently the temporary interim CEO. She was the founding president of the Long-Term Stock Exchange. So long-term capitalism conversation is coming very soon. But
what is the advantage to having a long-term stock exchange versus one that sort of adjusts and judges on quarterly returns?
Well, if you just extended so capitalism is fundamentally fucked, but if you just extended the time horizon that companies are optimizing for profit on, you would get better with the social outcomes that we care about. Right. And you get a lot of what was interesting is like the genesis for this from Eric is that you get a lot of company executives and asset owners wanting those longer term decision making, but it's the money managers that are incentivized for the quarter.
Yeah.
And so actually the friend was like, a lot of companies, a lot of tech companies would wait to go public because they didn't want to get captured by those quarterly incentives.
Oh
And
God.
and what that meant was that, you know, it exacerbated inequality because only the private investors that could get into companies and invest in companies and take advantage of their growth. So they would go public later and later and later. And then also what tech companies started to do was they would go public with what's called dual class shares. So there are two types of shares. There would be shares that the founders would have that had, like, you know,
Yeah.
10 times more rights than regular shares. So that would be a way to retain control
Mm-hmm.
and not fall prey to the sentiment. Snapchat went public with completely stripping voting rights for regular investors. And that was a big reason why they would do that. But yeah, I mean, if you know, people who aren't just trying to speculate on a stock and actually care about like long-term investment in the business prospect, you get much better alignment. I mean, it's capitalism. There's still an extraction incentive. There's still a growth imperative. So there's still things that are fundamentally flawed about that model, but it's a very valuable interim, right? Because part of the conversation that we had is like, how does change?
It's a step.
Right.
Yeah.
How do we move from where we are now? And actually, what's quite interesting was when I did the research for the long-term capitalism conversation, actually one of our first conversations. What I found was that there was a rise of money market capitalism, like in the 70s and beyond, because a lot of money flooded into the U.S. markets from university endowments, from foreign capital coming in to wanting to invest in the dollar. And what that created was, because prior to that, a lot of the people who were like investing in the stock market were investing their own capital.
Right.
And so that flood capital led to the rise of money managers, which led to like more short-term optimization. Executives started compensated on, you know, with their own equity in the company. That's when you start to see executive compensation go through the roof. So a lot of the worst, the kind of variation of capitalism that we're in now is because of that short-term incentive and the money market capitalism that took hold over the last couple decades.
Have you met Daniel Schmachtenberger yet?
Oh yeah, he's been on twice, and he'll be on again soon. He's a dear friend.
Okay, wonderful. He was recommended by somebody I trust here in the comments.
I'm happy to introduce him. He's yeah, I'll have him on again soon, actually.
What are the social changes that you see advantageously shifting as a result of this tangent that we're on, but I really want to know this long-term stock exchange interim solution to capitalism?
Yeah. I mean, again, I think that like, so there's something that's happening in tandem with the long-term capitalism piece.
Mm-hmm.
And this is like, I would dub as stakeholder capitalism. So, so 2019, I felt like was a turning point, at least in the rhetoric. So this is when you had the World Economic Forum, the Business Roundtable, which is it's a coalition of the largest public companies in the U.S. Larry Fink, CEO of BlackRock, all sort of simultaneously come out with statements around a shift from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism. So we're no longer optimizing for return to the shareholder. We're now optimizing for, you know, the needs of various stakeholders. And that's a very, very big change from, you know, at least like conceptually from Milton Friedman.
Teach us the difference between a stakeholder and a shareholder, for those of us that don't know.
Yeah, of course. I mean, a shareholder is someone who owns equity in the firm. They're effectively an investor. Sometimes you become a shareholder as an employee because you're granted shares, but you're holding on to a piece of the company. You're considered a quote unquote owner.
Yeah.
And so when there's a payout, you might get paid a dividend, or you can sell that share for a return if the share price goes up. Versus a stakeholder who, you know, again, employees often are given stock, but employees who don't own stock, or suppliers or customers or people in communities that are affected by business are all stakeholders that are, the planet could be considered a stakeholder, right? I mean, you could design governance structures however you want, but it's fundamentally the concept of managing a business for something other than the people who are incentivized financially, like to make
Got it.
more money based on their relationship to that entity.
Got it.
Um, and so so that's like a very top line shift in rhetoric around like what business is for,
Yeah.
right? That makes sense,
Totally.
right? And this relates to the long-term capitalism piece, right? And so the rubber really hits the road on this stuff in how you actually run the company. Like, how are you actually setting up decision making? Who holds power? Who holds authority? Like, and that's in like the nitty gritty of the company. And so with the long-term stock exchange, if you want to list on that stock exchange, you have to have like built those reforms into how you run the company.
Oh, got it.
And so that's what the long-term stock exchange does. It's
It's a
very
step.
exciting.
It is a step in the right direction.
Yeah.
I see.
Yeah, it's a big step in the right direction. And you can, companies can dual list on like the New York Stock Exchange or the NASDAQ and the long-term stock exchange. So it's not like it's easier for them to do that.
Right.
But Eric, to go back to the question about Dent, Eric, at the time, him and there were a handful of other Silicon Valley entrepreneurs who were doing really ambitious startups that were not the typical Silicon Valley playbook. So my husband was doing a really ambitious education play. Another friend was doing something in healthcare. Another friend was doing something in end of life care. And they were like, more regulatory intensive, more capital intensive, longer term horizon plays, a lot of things that just didn't fit the Silicon Valley mold. And they were naturally just talking to each other about what they were doing differently and how they were running their companies. And so this was probably like 8 years ago. Eric and I started organizing a quarterly like dinner with those CEOs to get together and talk about what they were doing. And this name came from Eric. He called it Dent because Dent connoted going after a big problem with humility.
Yes.
And I think that concept of humility is incredibly important.
Yes.
Because,
it's that expression of I can't tackle all of this, but at least I can make a dent.
Yeah. Yeah. Because especially, and that's actually one of Denizen's 6 values is humility. It's like we're talking about something so outrageous to a fact. Like you have to understand the fundamental limitations of how you might be able to understand something like that. Like Donella Meadows. Have you ever heard of Donella Meadows?
No.
She's amazing. You would love her. I'm going to send you her book. She was the lead scientist on this research called Limits to Growth, which was the first thing that came out that really said like it's batshit crazy to have infinite growth on a finite planet. And she was this incredible systems thinker. She died young, but she was absolutely adored in her community. She went to MIT. She studied complexity science, and she's wonderful. She's so quotable. She has all these amazing quotes about how she went into MIT studying complexity science, wanting to understand, like, how can we understand the system to control the system, right? And she came out saying, the system is far too complex for us to ever understand it. Like the idea that we can control the system is not possible. So what do we do when we have to come to terms with that? Because as humans, we separate ourselves from nature and we want to control nature. So what do we do when we have to come to terms with the fact that we can't control that? And she has this really stunning quote where she talks about like, we take our rationality as far as we can take it in modeling and understanding the systems. And then it takes all of our humanity. And this is something we talk about in our conversation, right? Like the wisdom that's in our bodies, right? And how do we integrate that into sensing and responding to this very complex adaptive system? She talks about dancing with the system.
Yeah.
But the humility that she brings into such a complex task, complex and necessary task is really, really amazing and really inspiring. So she has this book called Thinking in Systems, and it's actually a short book published posthumously, and talks about like how you can think about how complex systems work, and how she's got this great chapter that has 12 intervention points of a system. And like, the metrics that you optimize for versus the information flows versus one of the, and I love it so much. And I actually have an episode on, it's called Thinking in Systems. It's with Marta Cerrone, who runs the Academy for Systems Change, which used to be called the Danella Meadows Institute.
Right.
And you'll love this. One of the, like the second to top leverage point is paradigms. And she talks about how, like, we all have these paradigms that we don't even know that we have because they're pervasive and they're everywhere, and that they're, it's easy to shift in just like our own perspective, right? But then the very top one is to realize that, like, our paradigms are paradigms, and like it's like this meta realization that, like, you just have to laugh at just like how it's beautiful. She's amazing. You're going to love her. I'm going to send you some information on her.
Wonderful.
And she is one of the episodes, her life and her thinking. And so that book is really, really helped me a lot think about, like, interventions in this complex systems problem that we're talking about. Helps me parse out the conversation.
Yeah, I really appreciate the way in which you are coming at this conversation from all directions with all kinds of different people. You are a constant student. And that's why I want to stay connected with you. And that's why we're here together. Your studentship is everything. And I just want to from you.
Well, so are you. And there's so many parallels, right? I mean, that was what was so great about our conversation that came out today, was that it already, you in parallel have been doing, deep dives in so many different areas that I've touched on in my life and that I've touched on in the podcast. And so our conversation, it tied to the conversation about nonviolent communication. Yeah. It tied to an episode on parenting. It tied to an episode on change from within with Bobby Klein. It tied to an episode with Robert Gilman of the Bobby.
I have been in very close contact with several of his students. I know how missed he will be.
Yeah. He and I became very close. I feel very, very fortunate that we became very close in the last year of his life.
Wow.
He was the only therapist I ever had. And he was like a wizard, so he would channel all these crazy visions for me too. It was wild. He became like a father figure to me. Yeah. His daughter had passed away. We became very, very close. And that both my parents passed away last year.
No.
Bobby was like holding my hand through that.
Wow.
And then Bobby died 5 days before my mom.
Oh God.
Yeah. So it was like not just the two of them, but the three of them.
Okay.
I
didn't know that. I'm sorry, I had no idea.
Yeah, it was pretty wild. So I was really, really happy that I had one conversation with Bobby recorded that I released a couple of weeks ago, actually, on the anniversary of his death.
Okay, I'll go listen to that one. I hadn't heard it yet. The one that I loved, the one that I loved was on liberatory technology, that I think is really important for all of us to listen to. There are so many rivulets of information in this episode. And it really addresses directly how we can use technology for these systemic changes that need to come about. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and the team that there's three people who are my guests. They're the team behind an organization called Mobius.
Yeah.
And Mobius actually, it was started actually with Jack Kornfield was an advisor.
Right.
And in the early days, they were focused on working with the big tech companies and people who wanted to, shift the orientation of the tech to improving well-being. But then I love the story that they went through this big pivot, when they realized, like, wait a minute, we're an all-white team and we're trying to make this change, but we're not representing the change ourselves in the way that we run our organization. And so they went through a huge pivot. Actually, Davion Zaire, who, as
what
you
a
know,
voice.
so amazing.
What an incredible dude.
Amazing. So I did a conversation on a just and compassionate tech sector probably 2 years ago on Clubhouse, and I invited Davian to that. I did it with Aiden and her co-director at the time, and I brought Davian in as an incredible voice, and then they wound up working together. He's now co-director of Mobius with her, but to Aiden's credit, she did this total pivot, and she's like, why am I at the helm of this? And now all of their work supports Black and Brown and Indigenous technology founders.
Brilliant.
And so, it's really important for me to elevate those voices and support their work.
So the name of that episode on the Becoming Denizen podcast is Liberatory Technology. I want to recommend, if you're even remotely interested, to definitely have a listen. Our episode was launched today, and it is called
Fireside Chat with Elena Brower.
Oh, Fireside. That's what it was. Totally. Yeah. Wonderful.
And actually, it's just called the Denizen podcast now. It was called Becoming Denizen when I first launched it. But it was just like a mouthful. Well, two things. It was like a mouthful when I talked about it. People were like, what's your podcast called? And I was like, Becoming Denizen. And people doesn't necessarily know what the word denizen means.
Let's talk about that really fast. Let's talk about that. What does the word denizen mean?
Well, it means because it was we really liked dent, you know, and I had someone come and say like, hey, we have trademark for that, you can't use that, you need a new name. And it took us 9 months, and we did a very open design process with the community, came with a lot of hilarious opportunities along the way. But denizen means an inhabitant of a place, and so for us it's this provocation when we talk about systemic change around like, what does it mean to be a denizen of yourself, right? Of your community and of the planet. Because our whole thesis is that change happens from within. And the reason why our URL is Becoming Denizen, Levi's has denizen. Levi's has a
no way.
Denizen denim line. But Becoming Denizen, it captures something really fundamental about our thesis too, which is like, it's, you know, we're all indoctrinated into this system, and so it's a practice, and and we're always kind of becoming. It's not like, okay, I figured it out and I just do that thing now. That's what the URLs, but it was a handful, and then it turns out also from a trademark perspective, I needed the podcast to just be called Denizen, because Becoming Denizen wasn't Denizen for trademark purposes for podcasts. So it's just called Denizen Podcast now.
Denizen Podcast it is. I want to thank you for coming and talking with us. Thank you so much. Wonderful.
And I didn't hurry up.
Oh, how beautiful. It's a little choppy. The service
really?
is choppy, just a bit choppy.
Okay.
But I'm so happy to see. It's so beautiful where you are. It's gorgeous.
Thank you for having me on.
Thank you so much. The podcast is called the Denizen Podcast. Our episode is out this morning, Fireside Chat. Jenny is one of my very wisest friends, one of the greatest students I know, and I'm really happy that you came by today. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me. It was so great to be on with my first IG Live.
See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.